Should we jump right in?
Yeah, let
Shall
me just let me just introduce Hillel because everyone else introduced themselves. So guys, Hillel is one of the coolest people you will ever meet. I like to think of him as the ambassador to Israel's tech scene, and really is transforming the startup nation to the scaled nation. So among many things, he's a tech journalist, a startup marketer, a technology expert, a father, a husband, and he really works with tech companies, specifically in Israel, to help them, go from idea to revenue. He's also a super impressive tech influencer for companies including Google and Oracle. So he publishes a lot. Follow him on every platform you can imagine, and we're really excited to hear from him. So thank you, Hill, for joining us today.
your check is in the mail for that PR. Thank you. All right, let's jump in. All right, so a little background. From New York originally. By the way, if I'm speaking too fast, let me know. I'll slow down. I just want to get a lot in the next 40 minutes because I have a hard stop in 40 minutes from now. So I'm from New York, moved to Israel 28 years ago with my family. I was 15, middle of high school, which is not an easy age to go from New York to Jerusalem. It's quite a culture shock. But fast forward 28 years, I can tell you now it's the best thing that ever happened to me, both personally and professionally. On a personal level, married, 5 kids, living in a town between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv called Beit Shemesh. Tons of Americans here. My entire neighborhood are basically tech execs. The CFO of SimilarWeb is my next door neighbor. If you guys know SimilarWeb, it's just all tech. My entire neighborhood's tech. I love it. Basically, from a really, really early age, before it was cool to love tech, I love tech. Like, today geek is the new cool. Back then I was just a geek. And I remember where I was standing when I turned on the computer for the first time, and I was like, holy hell, I gotta be doing something with this in my life. Like, I gotta work in tech. I had no idea how I was going to get into it. And I studied political science. Like, I didn't even study anything to do with like computer science or anything like that. And when I finished my degree, I was like, all right, now what? I had no direction. I knew I loved tech. That was about all I knew. And someone said to me, listen, you have English. You're an English speaker. Obviously in Israel, Hebrew is the main language. You love tech and you love writing. Why don't you become a technical writer? I was like, that sounds cool. I don't know what that is, but sure. So I took a course in technical writing. I don't know if you guys know, but technical writers are the ones who write the user guides you get with your iPhone that no one ever reads. So that was my first job. Not exactly optimized for ADHD. Anyway, so I'm sitting there writing user guides for like Verizon and AT&T, literally the most boring job on the planet. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. This is not what I should be doing with my time. And so I started what we call today a blog. That wasn't a word back then. I just had thoughts about technology. I just started to write them. And this is a really important point because I was just some guy who loved tech. I'd never built a unicorn. I'd never done anything. I just loved tech. That was all I had, my passion. That's it. And when I started writing, people started to give me advice, put ads on the blog, monetize this, monetize that. And I'm like, listen, this isn't a business for me. I'm not looking to monetize anything. I have a job. This is, a passion. And that escalated because entrepreneurs started to reach out to me and say, listen, I read your writing. I love this article that you wrote. I love that article. I'd love to meet you. And I'm like, massive imposter syndrome. I'm like, you're the CEO of Waze. Why do you want to meet me? Like, who am I? So I'm like, fine, you want to meet? I'll meet you. And I was like, I meet these entrepreneurs and I'm like, what are you building? Pitch me. And the answer to that question always began with the dreadful words, we've developed an algorithm. And I'm like, dude, stop. I don't want to hear about your algorithm. What do you do? And they could not communicate. Like, these guys are brilliant at building tech. They could not communicate. I'll tell you guys a quick story that happened about 13 years ago. I met with a guy named Ron Levy, who is a serial entrepreneur. He ended up selling a couple of his companies, typical engineer. And he had developed an app called Flavor that was just an app to organize my photos. That's all it did, just organize my photos. Now, if I asked every single one of you to pitch me on an app that organizes your photos, you'd be like, my photos are a mess. I organize them for you. Like, it's just a simple pitch, right? I said to him, Ron, what do you do? This is what he said to me, and this is a direct quote, I promise, not exaggerating. He said, we've developed an algorithm that analyzes the metadata of your photos and organizes them based on geolocation. I was like, what the hell language are you talking? Like, that's how you speak to people? He's like, well, that's what we do. I'm like, that's not what you do. That's what you built. What do you do? And he could not tell me. So I explained to him, Apple released, Apple has a gallery. You replace the gallery. He's like, mind blown. I'm like, are you for real? Like, seriously? So I'd help these entrepreneurs with their pitch. And then I'd say to them, who are your competitors? And I'm sure you guys can guess what they would say to that. We have none. I'm like, are you for real? You really think no one else is trying to solve this problem? And so I tell them who their competitors are. And then I'd say, all right, what's your go-to-market? And they'd say the most ridiculous answers, a TechCrunch article. I'm like, that's your go-to-market. So I started to help these guys, and there was no money involved. It wasn't a business. And then all the advice started to, like, people start to pour, like, you got to make money this way, make money that way. I'm like, stop. Like, this is not a business. Like, and I connect these startups to VCs. They write checks, and then the entrepreneur would come back to me and say, listen, you brought us $15 million. Here's 5%. And I'm like, listen, the way I was able to help you raise that capital is because that investor trusts me. And I'm not going to jeopardize that trust for your 5%. Take your 5%, go build a company. I wish you luck. And I don't know how familiar I'm assuming you guys aren't familiar with Israeli culture, but in Israel, the worst thing you can be is a sucker. People are like, what's wrong with you? Why are you not taking money? And the truth is, I didn't have a sophisticated answer. In retrospect, though, not taking money in those early days was the best thing I ever did, because what I was doing, and now I know I was doing this, I didn't know back then, but what I was doing is I was establishing the most important asset in business, trust, right? These guys knew they could trust me. They knew that I could help them and there was no strings attached. And it turns out that's the best business model, because many of these companies came back to me sometimes 10 years later and said, listen, we know what you did for us. We experienced your capabilities. You don't have to sell us on what you can do for us. We know, because you already did it. So we want to work with you. Name your terms. And at that point, I have the leverage and I can define the terms. Whereas if I go to somebody and say, listen, pay me and I'll do something, then they define the terms. And so, like I said, turns out it was the best business model ever, but I didn't know it then. And I'll just read you guys a really, really beautiful email that I got. You guys know Flipboard? You know the app Flipboard? All right. So they're based in Palo Alto. When they came out on the iPad, I don't know, 10 years ago, I was like, this is the reason the iPad was created. Like, if you guys don't use Flipboard, highly recommend it. Now I'm already subjective. I'll tell you why in a second, but I love the product, like genuinely, authentically love the product. I started to write about them. I started to promote them, not because they asked me to. I wasn't even in touch with the team. I didn't even know them. They didn't know me. And I just did my thing. And about, I'd say 6 years into me promoting Flipboard, I get the following email from Mike McHugh, the CEO of Flipboard. The subject of the email is, thank you. Hillel, I won't ever forget your enduring support for what we've been building over the years. It's time we got you some stock and asked you to be a formal advisor. I know you wouldn't ask for this, but it's the right thing to do. I hope you'll accept, but you're only just beginning and I could really use your advice when you have the time. That email, that was the first one I got like that, but since then I've gotten like 50 emails like that. Literally half an hour ago, a company calls me up and says, listen, you don't remember, but when we launched 10 years ago, you really helped us with this and this and that. We gave you equity. We were just acquired. Just wired me money, literally. So long story short, today I wear 4 hats. No pun intended with my yarmulke. Hat number 1 is startups. Now, till today, 98% of the companies that I meet or help in any way, no strings attached. They don't pay me a dime. But 2%, much like the venture world, return my whole investment, right? Because then they come back to me and I either work with them on equity or retainer based on how active I am. But I have this portfolio of companies that I work with on growth, anything to do with qualitative growth, not running ads. I'm not an ad guy, but anything to do with, PR, social, content, biz dev, fundraising, whatever it is. And what I do with them also is dynamic. It changes based on the needs of the organization. Sometimes I'll join a company, because they need help with PR. And then 3 years into the engagement, they decide they want to raise capital. So I, kind of switch hats. So hat number 1, startups. Hat number 2 is content. It's all started from content, right? So today I write pretty much for every tech publication, TechCrunch, The Next Web, VentureBeat, Inc., Entrepreneur, Business Insider, all of them. It's a win-win. They get content, I get distribution, everybody's happy. And then about 4 years ago, I'm in Silicon Valley and I'm meeting, execs at Apple and Google and Facebook and Microsoft, and everyone's talking about Israel. And we'll talk about why in a second, but everyone's talking about Israel. And I'm like, oh, Waze? They're like, oh my God, I love Waze. I'm like, oh, Uri Levine, who's the founder of Waze? They're like, never heard of him. I'm like, what? I'm like, Mobileye? They're like, oh, it's such an amazing company. I'm like, oh, so Anon Joshua, the CEO, never heard of him. I'm like, why does everyone know who Mark Zuckerberg is, but not a single person can tell me who the founder of Wix is? I'm like, this is a really interesting phenomenon. I'm like, you know what? I'm meeting these people anyway. I'm going to come to my meetings with a camera, start interviewing people. So I started a vlog about 3.5 years ago. I'm up to episode like 450 something. I basically interviewed everyone in this ecosystem, every single VC, every single angel, every single CEO, almost. And again, it's not a business for me. Like, I don't monetize my content, never have, never will. But it, of course, opens a whole world to me, So I started that. And then about, like 8 months ago or something, I started a podcast because I had too much time on my hands. But we started a podcast and we've had some really cool guests on, like the Prime Minister and like the head of product at Waze and some really cool people. And it became, I think within 3 weeks, it became the top tech podcast in Israel. So that's the content hat. The third hat is this, a whole bunch of public speaking, whether it's, in, I don't know where, in tech companies around the world or speaking to, universities, colleges. I don't know, probably spoken at 150 cities over the last 10 years. I love this stuff. Like you'll hear, what's going on in Israel in terms of tech, we'll get to in a second, is just completely outrageous. And so if I could tell that story, I love it. So that's the third hat. And then the final hat is the most outrageous, given again that I'm just some random dude who love tech. I've never done anything. I've never built a unicorn. What have I done in my life? But I start getting pings from like Google. Google says to me, listen, we have a program called Google Developer Experts. We bring experts into Silicon Valley, experts in engineering and UX and UI and marketing. We want you to be part of the program. I'm like, all right, where do I sign? So I joined them. And then Oracle reaches out and they're like, we have a startup advisory board we want you to be on. I'm like, all right, you had me at hello. And then Huawei and Microsoft, I tweeted about why when I leave a Slack channel, it notifies everyone that I left. And Microsoft Teams tweeted me back and said, come meet Microsoft Israel. We want you to be our brand ambassador. I'm like, all right. So I went to meet them. And so I'm working with all these multinationals as like an ambassador or influencer, whatever you want to call it. They all call it something else, but it's all the same. So that's pretty much kind of in a nutshell what I'm doing. But like I said in the beginning, I'm a kid in a candy store every day. Like I literally genuinely feel incredibly blessed to meet the most incredible people. Like I can tell you guys stories. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time, but just to give you one tiny little example, about 8 years ago, I said, to increase my traffic, my readership, I said, I'm gonna start interviewing people. And I aimed like super high, like unattainably high. Like the top of my list was Steve Wozniak. I'm like, I got to meet Steve Wozniak. I got to interview the guy. Long story short, it's a long story because it lasted about 3 years, the story, until I finally got him. I interviewed him on my blog and, it was cool. He gave me some cool stories about the early days of Apple, but it was all done, over email. I didn't met him. And about 6 months after the interview, I get a phone call one day, and he says, hey, hello, this is Steve. And I'm like, Steve who? He's like, it's Steve Wozniak. I'm like, come on, who's pranking me? I'm like, who is this? Seriously? He goes, yeah, it's Steve Wozniak. I'm coming to Israel for 24 hours. Let's have breakfast. So I find myself in the lobby of a Tel Aviv hotel with the flipping founder of Apple, like I who invented the home computer. Like it doesn't get more surreal than that. So that's just one tiny example, but like the craziest things have happened to me on social media over the last 10 years. Ellen DeGeneres follows me. Like what? On what universe is that like logical in any way, shape, or form? So I'm still like shocked whenever these things happen to me, but I've been really, really fortunate to be able to leverage my platform to talk about important things, whether it's mental health or, a couple of months ago, a friend of mine calls me and, it was a very hard phone call for him because as you guys know, men and their egos. And he said, listen, I really need a job. Like I'm not supporting my family. I really, really need a job. Now, a lot of people ask me to help with jobs. So I usually take their CV and pass it on to companies, but if I wrote a post about every person that asked me to help, I wouldn't be doing anything else. But this guy sounded really down. So I wrote a post on LinkedIn and I said, he's a really, talented guy, blah, 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 whatever. I wrote the post. He calls me up like 3 or 4 days ago. This was like 2 months ago. He calls me 3 or 4 days ago. He goes, I got 80 offers, 80. He goes, I just signed my dream job. He's like, the CEO of this company is a silent follower of yours. We call that stalking. But anyway, he's like, he follows you. He's never said a word to you, but he saw that post. He hired me. He's like, we had our first meeting today to discuss how to thank you. I was like, you guys don't have to thank me, but this guy, like, social media, like with all and there's downsides, but you could really change lives. And that's what I've learned over the years. And I'm very fortunate. So, all right, let's talk a little bit of tech here. You want any questions before I jump in? That was just an intro. All right, keep going. So I don't know how much you guys know about Israel, but many years ago, a guy named Saul Singer wrote a book called Startup Nation. And he basically explained how it is that a country smaller than New Jersey in the worst neighborhood on earth, right? The most unstable region on planet Earth is dominating in all sectors of tech. And when I say dominating, I'm not saying we're number one in the world, but we are number one in many sectors, but not in every sector, but number two, number three. A nice metric to look at is NASDAQ, right? What country has the most companies on NASDAQ or the public market? I should say NASDAQ, public markets. So US is number one, makes sense. Number two, China, 1.5 billion people. Number three, Israel, 9 million people. Like outrageous, right? Israel has more entrepreneurs per capita than any country in the world by a massive margin. Like we're not even talking. I mean, just to give you just a little perspective here, the entire EU has about 130, 140 unicorns. Israel is about to hit 100. Like it's outrageous, right? So in 2021, Israeli companies raised $21 billion, which again, just like put it in perspective here. Like, can you imagine New Jersey companies raising $21 billion? It's ridiculous. And really what I find most interesting is that, like I said, it's sector agnostic, right? We used to be very strong at at cyber because of the military and semiconductors, but now there's pretty much no sector of technology in which Israel is not a dominant player. Even, what's interesting is because we're such a tiny country, our weakest link was always consumer tech, right? Because how are you going to build a consumer app, with 9 million people in your country? And so that was really a pretty weak link for us traditionally It's no longer. I mean, I'm sure you guys use many consumer apps that are developed in Israel, whether it's Facetune, that's pretty much the top of the app store across the world, and Lemonade's Insurance and Fiverr, Wix, and on and on and on. So there are some incredible consumer companies in Israel. So like I said, it's across sectors, but I want to give you guys a little bit of a wider perspective on why what's going on here is so outrageous. Okay, so there are many ways to look at an ecosystem. So let's try to look at it from different angles. So angle number one is capital, right? How much capital? So there's, like I said before, there's money flowing in like water into this country, and it's not only how much, but it's coming from all directions, right? So every single top tier investor, VC in Silicon Valley, with one exception, Andreessen, has set up shop in Israel, right? You guys, Insight's pouring money into Israel, right? But Andreessen Horowitz is the only top tier VC that has no presence in Israel. And I interviewed Mark. You could read that interview on VentureBeat. It was a really cool interview. And I said, Mark, why are you guys not in Israel? Like every one of your, colleagues has set up shop in Israel. Why are you not in Israel? He said, because Andreessen Horowitz has a one office rule. We're only in Menlo Park, but when we open our second office, it'll be in Tel Aviv, which blew my mind. Like not in LA, not in New York, in Israel. So that's just an example, but the money is flowing from everywhere. Top tier VCs in Silicon Valley, obviously New York, et cetera. But also you look at Asia, like Alibaba, the monstrous Alibaba has one. This is the craziest, like these words, like every time I say it, it just blows my mind. Alibaba has one strategic partnership with a venture capital firm in the world, one. And he gets this, Jerusalem Venture Partners. Like what? It doesn't make any sense, right? They're not partnering with, Sequoia or Benchmark or Excel or Lightspeed or Insight. Jerusalem Venture Partners. So the capital that's flowing is coming from all directions at the highest. It's high quality, smart money. It's not just, grandparents throwing money at it. This is smart people. That's the grandparents aren't smart people, but you know what I mean? So tons of capital and high quality capital. So those two things are, from my perspective, an interesting metric to look at how successful an ecosystem is. But then, what drives all this stuff? What drives all these, these tech companies? Obviously, it's innovation. So, I could name you 300 companies now that have come up with products that like normal people don't even think this way. But I'm just going to give you one example, just one. Okay. You guys think about your office, right? Your home office, your work office, whatever. You have devices on your desk, right? And all of these devices have evolved over the years, right? We all have a supercomputer in our pockets. Like everything's evolved, except for one device. There's one device that sits on all our desks. I promise you, all of you have it on your desk. And it's like, oh my God, I got to use the printer. And it's like dusting off the printer. And it's this big clunky machine that has not evolved. And I'm not talking about like 3D printing. I'm talking about consumer printing in my house. I need to print a document. Like it doesn't make any sense that, remember, I don't know if you guys remember dial-up, that annoying noise that dial-up made. It's the printer's making like zoom, zoom, zoom. What is that? Like, it's 2021. How come it hasn't evolved? And so the answer is pretty simple. You have to put a piece of paper into the printer. It has to be the size of a paper. It can't be smaller, right? Well, that's how normal people think. Comes along an Israeli entrepreneur named Tuvia Elbaum, originally American, and he came up with the craziest thing. It's a mobile robotic printer. You don't put the paper into the printer. You put the printer on the paper, and it walks on the paper and prints. It's this big. So it's called Zuta Labs. It's just one example of they say thinking out of the box. Israeli entrepreneurs don't even have a box. Like who even thinks that way, right? So the creativity and the innovation is just bonkers. Okay, so that's just another metric. Then you want to look at the unicorns. Like I said before, we're about to hit 100 unicorns, which is just completely nuts. And what's even more interesting is not just the unicorns. I don't know what the next term is, but we're talking about, I don't know, let's say Mobileye, right? It's an autonomous driving technology company. They were acquired by Intel for $15.3 billion around. You look at Wix, we're talking, I don't know, I haven't checked their market cap today, but anywhere between $15 and $20 billion. Checkpoint is a cyber. I mean, we're talking not just unicorns anymore. We're talking about multi-billion dollar companies. And the amount of IPOs, in this past year, just because of SPACs and all these things, is just completely nuts. Every day is another IPO. So that's, in terms of that. So there's also the multinationals, right? You look at the multinational corporations, the tech companies, and you look at where they set up shop. Every single tech company, without exception, the big ones, have not only set up shop in Israel, but are building core elements of their experience in Israel. So, I don't know, if iPhone, everyone's iPhone here, I assume? Raise your hand, you're an iPhone? iPhone. Okay, so when you unlock your phone with Face ID, that is technology that was developed by a company that was acquired, an Israeli company that was acquired, and they integrated into the iPhone. When you Google something and it says, did you mean this? That's developed in Israel. When Microsoft's pouring money into into entrepreneurs and like investing as a VC. Microsoft Ventures was founded here in Herzliya. So all of, can go on and on. I mean, Facebook's building Facebook Lite here for emerging markets, because obviously in emerging markets, people don't have broadband, they don't have fast internet, so they can't load, the full Facebook. So they're building a Facebook Lite for emerging markets. Oculus is here. I mean, core elements. These multinationals are here in a big way, which is unbelievable. But all of that, not belittling it, it's all nice. But to me, the biggest kind of, I guess, indication that this is really a maturing ecosystem are the impact companies. The companies, and I'm talking about tech companies, right? Not nonprofits. I'm talking about tech companies that are making a lot of money by making the world a better place, right? Doing well by doing good, right? So I wrote a column in the Jerusalem Post for years. And when the editor-in-chief asked me to write, I was like, okay, I'm not going to write another column about like Waze and Wix. Let's make it a little unique. And I'm like, my criteria is going to be a company that's making the world a better place. That's it. I'm like, well, how do you define that? I'm like, I'm going to define it. It's my column. I'm going to define it. And so I went pretty, anything to do with healthcare and, whatever it is. I had, honestly, guys, I had no idea when I agreed to do this, if there are 5 companies like that or 500. I had no clue. I literally had no clue. And I started it, and my inbox started to look like World War III, because there was just hundreds of startups pouring into my inbox. So, I mean, you could look at my column on Jerusalem Post to see these companies. I mean, I'm not, this isn't like a figure of speech. They're literally making the world a better place across all sectors. It's wild. So to me, a woman named Sivan Yaari, who's French, originally moved to Israel. And this is just one example, but guys, after we're done here, open YouTube and just Google in YouTube, Innovation Africa. Okay. What did this woman do? It's just, I'm telling you, you'll cry. Like, bring tissues. I'm not even kidding. So this woman said, on every roof in Tel Aviv, we have solar power, right? Solar panels. In these remote villages in Africa, they have no running water. She's like, that discrepancy is unacceptable. Like, we got to do something about this. So she literally built infrastructure to bring flowing water, like, to these crazy African villages you never heard of. And if you watch it on YouTube, and I highly recommend you do, you see these African kids playing with the running water. They've never seen running water before. And they're thanking their brothers and sisters from Israel. It's wild. That's just one example. I mean, literally, there are hundreds and hundreds of companies that are doing incredible things. I had the opportunity to interview a guy named Dr. Rick Klausner. He was the director of the National Cancer Institute. He was the guy that every president of the United States came to and said, here's a blank check, cure cancer. He managed more cancer research money than anyone in the world. Okay, it's a fact. So he left the National Cancer Institute and he joined an Israeli company as a chairman, a company called Wisdo.com, which is basically like a Waze for life. It helps you navigate through your challenges in life. And so I interviewed him, and the interview's on YouTube. It's bananas. It's completely nuts. I said to him, I don't understand, with all this tech, how are people still dying of cancer? How have we not cracked cancer? And I expected him to say, this reason or that reason. He goes, we have. I'm like, what now? And he goes, listen, we have, after hundreds of years of research, figured out a way to rein in a person's immune system to kill their own cancer. He says, it's not necessarily, on the market yet, FDA approves all that stuff, but in the labs, and I want to be very clear here, because I once said this, and someone came to me from the audience and said, listen, my son-in-law has leukemia. Can you cure him? I'm like, whoa. So I have to be very clear here. A lot of these treatments are in the lab. They're not yet available. But he said leukemia and lymphoma, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to say something wrong. Watch on YouTube, but 2 types of cancer cured in the labs. And again, it's not yet on the market, but it will be. And then when he started going down the list of all the treatments that are deployed globally in hospitals around the world, he's like, and this one was developed in the Weizmann Institute, and this one was developed in Hebrew University, and this one was developed in Bahrain. Every single one of these leading treatments was developed in this tiny little country that's a speck on the map. It blew my mind. And I had the same experience with another guy named Peter Cash. He's also one of the world-renowned experts on cancer research. He literally named like 30 treatments that are deployed globally, every single one of them developed in Israel. So to me, that's the punchline, right? It's all great that Google's here. It's all great that we're making billions and that money's pouring in from all. It's great. I'm not belittling that, but are we making the world a better place? The answer is yes. And that to me is much more important than anything else. So, no matter how you want to look at this ecosystem, there's something remarkable going on here. And I'll just say one more thing and we'll open up to questions. And that is that the book Startup Nation is highly recommended, and she was just reading and learning about it. But I don't want to say that like it's passé. It's not passé, but we've kind of evolved, right? One of the reasons, by the way, and Mark said this in the interview also, I said, how come you're not deploying as much capital into Israel? He said, because you guys sell too early. You don't let companies mature. And that really was the case traditionally. Israeli companies, they got an offer of 50 million, 100 million, they took it, which was a big mistake. Even Waze sold for $1 billion. If they had waited, they'd probably worth 10 times that. So he said, you guys sell too early. And that was really the case. That's no longer the case. And like I said, we're graduating out of Startup Nation, right? Call it Unicorn Nation, call it whatever you want to call it. But we're building, I have not heard the words exit strategy in years. No entrepreneur is talking about exit strategies anymore. People are looking to build multi-billion-dollar companies, if not more. And that's what's interesting to them. And the VCs that come to me and say, give me deal flow, they're like, we are not looking at companies that are going to reach a $500 million valuation. We're not interested. Send us companies that can reach billions. And that's really the mentality here. People are looking to build massive, sustainable businesses. And that to me is like, it's very, very exciting. And then there's also one more thing, and that is the additional layer, right? So you have the bottom layer of the tech companies, but now there's another whole layer, another whole ecosystem of venture, right? There are so many venture capital firms here in Israel. I'm not even talking about the global ones, just locally. There's endless. And so, I think investors are starting to understand what kind of opportunity we have here in Israel. And yeah, it's never been this exciting. I just got off the phone an hour ago with a family office. They're like, we want to get in on tech. I'm like, what? They're like, we're going to hire you. You're going to bring us deal flow. You're going to help us with diligence. I'm like, all right, let's do it. So everyone wants to get on the action. It's really, really exciting. The energy, and again, Startup Nation, the book talks about how this happened. And it's a much longer conversation, but honestly, the energy and the entrepreneurial spirit is something like you've never seen anything like this. Like you get into a cab in Tel Aviv and you're like, oh, so how long have you been a cab driver? They're like, oh, I'm not a cab driver. I'm an entrepreneur. I have 2 startups. I'm just doing this on the side. Like everyone has startups here, right? And the government promotes it. There's innovation authority that gives grants without equity. Obviously the military teaches innovation and, all the intelligence units. There is a cultural aspect here, which is, I guess, me looking at the cup half full, because Israelis are very, how do I say this nicely? Very direct. Let's just say it this way. I often talk about the difference in sales and marketing, and I say it's summed up in one word. And that one word does not exist in Hebrew. Literally, there's no such word. And the word is subtlety. There's no such word in Hebrew, because Israelis are very subtle people, for better or for worse. And so when it comes to innovation, you tell someone in wherever what you want to build, what you're trying to build is impossible. Most normal people be like, all right, if it's impossible, it's impossible. Israelis are like, really? Watch this. And they go and they build it. Like, it's crazy. The level, everyone's so innovative here and just wants to push forward and break all ceilings. And it's really remarkable. So that's kind of high level about what's going on here. Do you have any questions? Otherwise, I could keep talking about this for 4 months. Any questions? Should I continue? Should we talk about venture a little bit? All right, venture. So traditionally, prepare questions, guys. Otherwise, I'll just keep yapping. So traditionally, Israeli companies had more, I'd say, conservative valuations. So, an Israeli entrepreneur building something in Israel, the company might be valued at whatever, $50, $100 million. And literally you get on a plane for 15 hours, land in Silicon Valley, that exact same company worth 10 times that. And that was pretty frustrating for Israeli entrepreneurs. And so a lot of entrepreneurs went and kind of opened up sales and marketing in the US, and, they wanted to increase their valuation. And I understand that. But I was saying for years already, I was saying to people, like, you think it's a bad thing that our valuations are low? It's not, because when the market corrects itself in Silicon Valley, I don't want to say when the bubble bursts. I don't think we're in a bubble, and it's a longer discussion. But to me, a bubble means that we're investing in like vanity and like stupid, nothing. That's not the case. There's obviously more innovation today than there's ever been before. So it's not a bubble. But you look at companies, I don't know, Magic Leap, and don't get me wrong, I love their technology. I don't know if you guys have ever tried it, but this is a company that raised. Let me just listen to what I'm saying, because they raised from investors $3.5 billion with a B before they had a product. This is a company worth $6 billion before they had a product. Like, outrageous, right? By the way, the CEO is the nicest guy in the world. He's like probably the smartest person I've ever spoken to in my life. But that's problematic, I think, when you're a company raised $6 billion. And by the way, to be clear, they raised from like the most sophisticated investors in the world. I'm not talking about like dumb. They raised from everyone. I think Google invested in them. If I'm not mistaken, Google Ventures and Alibaba invested in them, and Amazon, like big investors. But they're building the future. That's the truth. They're building something called mixed reality. We all know VR, virtual reality, AR, augmented, but this is something else. You basically can't differentiate between what's real and what's not real. It's completely like bananas. Like I tried Gen 1 and I put it on, and he said, the guy who's demoing it says to me, walk over to that table and lay down dominoes. And I have a controller in my hand. I walk over to the table, I lay down dominoes, and the dominoes stand on the table. And he says, now walk over and hit the first one, knock them over. I walk over, haptic feedback. I feel in my hand that I hit something. They fall over. I pick up the goggles. There's no table. No table, no dominoes. The whole thing's fake. I'm like, what the? I'm like, is there a wall there? Or am I imagining it? Like, completely nuts. And when I spoke to the CEO, he said, by the way, what you tried was Gen 1. He says to me, I brought in a world-renowned neuroscientist who I gave access to Gen 5, the only person that ever saw Gen 5. He said the guy started to cry, literally started to cry. He's like, you are accessing parts of the human brain we are not meant to access. He's like, this is not, I'm sure you've seen the demo on YouTube where a whale jumps out of the floor. You ever see this? People are sitting in an auditorium and a whale jumps, a full like size whale jumps out and like you see like water splashing. Obviously there's no water. It's nuts. Look up Magically. But anyway, my point is a company worth $6 billion with no product is problematic. And so, I always said like, it's not bad that we don't have crazy monstrous valuations. Valuations should be somewhat tied to revenue. This is a longer discussion. I don't know if you guys watch Silicon Valley, but to me, the funniest scene in that entire show was the CEO, whatever his name is, talking to the startup. He's like, and our revenue model. And then the investor gets up and goes, what do you mean your revenue model? He goes, well, we want to make money. He goes, what are you, nuts? Why would you want to make money? He says, once you make money, your valuation is tied to revenue. Right now, you're pre-revenue. You can be worth anything. And it's funny, but it's somewhat true. Like, valuations are completely, and Elon Musk, famously said that the reason Tesla's worth that much more than GM, even though GM sells 20x cars, is because, valuations are based on dreams, on projections, on the future, not on the past. And he says, traditional car makers are building the past. We're building the future. Okay, debatable. We can discuss it. Obviously, it hit the fan with WeWork. Discussion for another time. But I just want to say one thing, and that is that, and I'm sure every single one of you are going to disagree with what I'm about to say, but I heard Adam Newman speak, the CEO of WeWork, by far, hands down, without even any competition, the most charismatic person I ever heard speak in my life. Okay, and someone asked him from the audience the obvious question: you guys are bleeding money. You're worth $48 billion. You're this real estate company, and you're bleeding money. When are you going to be profitable? So he said what I think is a very intelligent answer. He said we could be profitable tomorrow. He's like, if we put on the brakes on growth and we focused on monetization and on profitability, we'd be profitable tomorrow. But we're not. We're focused on becoming the fastest growing real estate company in history. We're swallowing up, properties left and right. We're focused on growth. And, a good friend of mine was one of the first employees at Facebook. And he told me that early on, he came to Zuckerberg and he said, I know how to monetize. And Zuck said, listen, he got up, he wrote on the whiteboard, growth. He's like, we're not looking to monetize. We're looking to grow. And I know that sounds strange, but in reality, those things are mutually exclusive. And in early days of a startup, I'll give you a very, very basic example. If you're, you have an app, right? You have an app. So you now have a choice. Do I put ads in my app, which will be a crappy experience, but I'll make a couple of bucks? Or do I build an amazing experience people are going to love and I'm making no money, but once we hit critical mass down the line, in Facebook's case, 2.5 billion daily users, then we'll flip the switch on monetization. And, a lot of people have a problem with that. You're like Uber and Amazon was losing money for years, right? To me, that's the only way to do it. Like, I always give the example of a lemonade stand, right? If I'm 12 years old and I have a lemonade stand in my neighborhood, I have to go to the supermarket and buy a table and a tablecloth and a sign and lemonade and water. So I'm losing money, but that's not losing money. That's investing in the business. You can't have a lemonade stand unless you buy those things. You can't build a successful tech company unless you invest in the business early on. And that includes investing in human capital. So, I remember when WeWork had an offsite and they brought Red Hot Chili Peppers, the whole internet went crazy. What are you doing? You're losing money. But they're investing in their employees, right? Keeping their employees is incredibly important and top priority for them. So it's not a waste of money. And again, this is debatable. I don't know, whatever you guys think about this, but that's just my opinion. In any case, though, in Israeli, in terms of valuations, we're not at Silicon Valley level, but unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to look at it, they're starting to increase. Or we're seeing, again, don't want to use the word bubble, but we're seeing some valuations that don't make much sense, at least from a traditional perspective. So yeah, that's pretty much what's going on. I see we have a question here in the chat. What lessons do you think Silicon Valley can learn from the Israeli ecosystem? Great question. But who asked that? Sorry, who asked that? Alexa. Okay, it's a great question. There are a lot of things. I think that Israeli mentality of failure, when it comes to failure, Israeli entrepreneurs glorify failure. I know that sounds funny, but I actually think it's the right way to do it, because when you fail, you learn much more than when you succeed. And so, I'll often find myself in meetings with Israeli entrepreneurs and they say to me, yeah, I have 2 failed startups. By the way, I have 2 failed startups. And they're like so proud of it. And I think that's the right way, because if you learn from those mistakes, you learn from, and I think that's something that not necessarily Silicon Valley, but I think that's something very uniquely Israeli. Like, let's fail, let's get up, let's do it again. Or as Zuck says, move fast, break things, right? That's one thing. I'm trying to think of listen, Silicon Valley, obviously it's where it's at. So we have a lot to learn from Silicon Valley. What they have to learn, I mean, I guess, resourcefulness, just to be resourceful. We're a tiny little country. We have no resources. We're tiny, and yet we're doing what we're doing. So I feel like with all the money in Silicon Valley, they could be doing significantly more. So that's maybe something they could learn from Israel. I mean, those are just two things that pop into my head. All right, guys, now you have to ask questions because I've been talking the whole time. Yes, you can ask. I want to do it like this. We'll do it through chat. Okay, how does go-to-market look like for Israeli companies? If
My internet's terrible, so that's why I typed it.
No problem. So how does go-to-market look like for Israeli companies if they're going international pretty much at day one? Fantastic question. To be very clear, you cannot build a business on 9 million people. So no Israeli company is targeting a local market. That's not a thing. So every tech company is scaling globally. A lot of times, I heard the CEO of Waze say that had he not built a sales and marketing force in the States, he would never have succeeded. But had he not left his R&D in Israel, he also would never have succeeded. So a lot of entrepreneurs are kind of leaving their R&D here, although that's also a challenge lately because the talent's being swallowed up by Amazon and Facebook and Google. So prices are being jacked up, and it's a problem. That's probably Israel's biggest problem is talent, lack of talent, or shortage of talent, I should say. But a lot of tech companies, almost all tech companies, I would say, that are scaling are opening up shop in the US. So I think they usually open up an office there, or at least have a man on the ground. I've worked with many companies. I worked with a company called Intelligo that's AI powered background checks. And I flew with the CEO to DC, and we met with like top government officials because they need background checks that are actually like modern and normal. Like literally the US government told me they have a 300,000 person backlog of people that want to come into the US because they're running background checks. It takes a month. These guys do a background check in 30 minutes. So like when we told them, they were like drooling. That was just one example. But the point is, go to market in terms of Israeli companies is they set up shop there. They usually hire like a seasoned marketing executive that's very not Israeli, more subtle, more relationship oriented. And they just go to market. And I guess US is kind of the primary market for most companies. I just came from the 2 weeks ago, I just came from the Canary Islands in Spain. And they have a whole ecosystem there. They have a VC on the island. They have several startups, and they're trying to like incentivize. They brought me in there, me and 4 other bloggers, to promote the destination to the Israeli population. And so they set me up all these business meetings, and their goal is to try to bring entrepreneurs because there's tax, there's no taxes there and all kinds of incentives. But I'm like, I mean, that's great, but like, who's not going to go and set up shop in the US to set up shop in the Canary Islands? Like, I don't want to insult them, but like, let's be realistic here, So in terms of go-to-market, almost every company is setting up shop, sales and marketing in the US. All right, we've got 1 or 2 more minutes, guys. Any questions? By the way, Shalva, did you ask if it's okay to take a picture? Is everyone okay with taking a picture?
Hillel wanted to know if it's okay if he can have screenshots and recording.
Any objections?
Everyone.
No objections? All right, let's take a nice screenshot. Screenshots are the selfies of 2021, right? It's ridiculous. Who would have believed this would be the situation? All right, smile. Beautiful. All right. So listen, guys, I sadly have a hard stop, but listen, Shalva, please give everyone my email or whatever. Feel free to reach out. If I can help with anything, obviously I'm happy to help. And if you have any questions offline, feel free. You'll see that I'm obsessed with inbox zero. So I respond to emails in about 12 seconds. Or you can DM me on Twitter or whatever. And it sounds like you guys are doing some awesome stuff. Super cool to meet you all. And I look forward to connecting in real life when this psychotic situation comes to an end.
Thanks, guys. Awesome. Thank you, Hillel.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. I'm sorry that I have to run. I have a family thing I got to go to.
No worries.
Of course.
Take care, guys. Thanks, Shalva. Bye, everyone.